All right, let's jump right into a really fascinating puzzle today. How do we make sense of traditions that seem to pop up long after the original stories they're based on? I mean, if something comes later, does that automatically make it false? Let's dig in and find out.
So, here's the big idea we're kicking off with, and it's something you hear a lot in historical debates. The assumption that if a tradition wasn't there from day one, it must be some kind of later invention, something inauthentic. This is the core problem we're going to unpack. But you gotta ask, right? Does history really work that way? Is it just a clean slate where new things totally replace old ones? Or is there something a little more complex, a little more interesting going on?
To really get to the bottom of this, we first need to understand what our source calls a common fatal error. We have to look at the evidence that makes this argument that later equals false seem so convincing in the first place. And to be fair, the people who make this argument, they've got some points. Their case is built on some pretty clear historical facts. So let's put on our skeptic hats for a minute and really examine the evidence they're looking at. And this brings us to what are called the post-epic layers. These are major parts of religious life that were added long after foundational stories like the Ramayana and Mahabharata were already well established.
Okay, so check out this timeline. It's kind of wild. The Epic Age, we're talking way back, 1200 to 800 BCE. But then, look at the gaps. The Puranas, a super important set of texts, they don't show up for about 500 years. The Bhakti movement, this huge wave of personal devotion, even later. And get this, massive stone temples, we're talking more than 1,000 years later. If you're a critic, this is your smoking gun.
And let's take a closer look at that Bhakti movement. This wasn't just some dusty old theological debate. No, this was a full-blown social revolution. It came about for very specific reasons, as a reaction against rigid social rules and cold, impersonal rituals. People were hungry for a direct, personal, and emotional connection to God, and Bhakti gave them that. It was a kind of mass devotion that just didn't exist back in the Epic Age. And the evidence just keeps piling up. It wasn't only about new devotional movements. The actual infrastructure of worship, the very gods people prayed to, the temples they built, and the festivals they celebrated also started to look really different from what you see in the original epics.
Yeah, this chart just lays it all out, doesn't it? Back in the Epic Age, religion was kind of private. It was centered on your household or maybe the king's court. But later, boom, it just explodes into the public square. You get these vast temple networks, merchant guilds start sponsoring things, and suddenly you have these huge calendar-based festivals for everybody. It's a completely different world.
And here's maybe the biggest shocker of all for some folks. Some of the most beloved deities worshipped today became super prominent way after the epic period. We're talking about Ganesh, powerful forms of the goddess like Durga and Kali, Jagannath. Their widespread worship took off centuries, sometimes even a millennium later. So if you're trying to prove everything was fabricated, this looks like an open and shut case.
So you can see why the critics' argument feels so powerful, right? The timeline doesn't lie. Major texts, huge movements, temples, festivals, even some of the gods, they are factually late additions. It's really easy to look at all that evidence and just conclude, see, the whole thing was made up later. But, and this is the huge but, this is exactly where that whole argument falls apart. The facts are right, yeah, but the conclusion? That's what our source calls the critic's mistake. So now, we're going to flip this whole thing on its head.
The whole idea that later automatically means false? Well, our source argues that's just a fundamental misunderstanding of how culture and history actually work. It's what's known as a category error. It's like you're applying the wrong kind of logic to the problem. And this analogy just hits it out of the park. It's basically the same as saying that because magnificent Gothic cathedrals were built 1,000 years after Jesus, he must be a mythical figure. I mean, nobody would seriously argue that, right? It sounds ridiculous. We all understand that those cathedrals were built because of his importance. The exact same logic applies here. So if it's not a fabrication, what is actually happening? The term for it is cultural layering. Think of it like layers of rock in the earth. Cultures don't just bulldoze their past and start over. No, they build on top of it. They add new layers of meaning, new practices, new interpretations, all on that same foundational core. And once you see it that way, everything changes. All those later additions, the temples, the Bhakti movement, the new festivals, they aren't proof of fabrication. They are powerful evidence of the original core's enduring significance. They show that these stories were so important that generations of people kept finding new, incredible ways to express their devotion. Okay,
So how does this layering process actually work? How does a culture seamlessly integrate new ideas so they feel ancient and authentic? How does history slowly become a living, breathing tradition?
Well, there's a kind of strategy to it. First, you attach your new ideas to the old heroes that everyone already reveres. Second, you retell those epic stories, but you reinterpret them to speak to new social realities. And finally, you present these innovations not as something new, but as part of a timeless, eternal truth. This isn't about deception. It's about how a tradition stays alive and relevant.
And each of these layers added a whole new dimension. The Puranas, they took history and transformed it into cosmic theology. The Bhakti movement came along and infused that memory with intense, personal emotion. The temples gave that emotion a grand, monumental home, and the festivals brought the entire community together to experience it collectively.
This brings us to a much more nuanced and frankly more beautiful understanding. The great epics didn't just create modern Hinduism in a single shot. Instead, the vast, diverse tradition we call modern Hinduism grew around them, using them as an anchor, a foundation, and a constant source of inspiration.
And in the end, all these layers, all this evolution over centuries points to a really profound conclusion. A purely fabricated story just doesn't inspire this kind of devotion for this long. As our source says, only real history generates a living tradition, one that is this vibrant, this adaptable, and this alive.
It's a powerful lens for looking at the world, isn't it? It makes you wonder, what living traditions in your own community, your own country, or your own life are built on ancient layers that you may have never even noticed? Something to think about. Thanks for joining us.